Okay, good. So hi, welcome to Beyond Responsive Breakpoints Designing Adaptive Components. The idea of this talk is a little bit to say, okay, we have those media queries, we have responsive layout, we have responsive web design. How can we go the extra steps and what can we actually do to build truly adaptive components? So I'm Stephanie Walter. I'm a UX designer in Luxembourg. I work for a consulting agency, and I'm currently working for the European Investment Bank in Luxembourg. Let's dig right in. So let's talk about going beyond those arbitrary mobile screen sizes. This book is 10 years old. So 10 years ago, a really nice person called Ethan Marcotti built, actually, he gave a talk, I think, at a Lister part or a book, an event apart, and then he wrote a book called Responsive Web Design. And in this book, he's talking about making website adapt to different screen sizes using fluid grids, flexible images, and media queries to adapt to the layout. So yeah, it's a little bit strange to say, okay, we have actually been using this for 10 years now. And usually when talking about responsive web design, the first thing people come and ask me is, okay, what kind of breakpoint do you recommend I use in my design or in my front ends? So the first thing I would advise people is don't define your breakpoint on exact device width that you are looking to target. Base them instead on layout and content. This is super important. And in my experience, when building responsive web design, I've kind of seen that we usually tend to gravitate around this kind of two types of media queries. So primary, which will be used to adapt global layout, and secondary, which will be used to adapt the design at more like component granular level. So adapting to layout, let's take a small kind of easy example. Let's build a cooking website. So I hope you've ate, because there's going to be a lot of picture of pizza in this talk. I'm sorry if you haven't, and feel free to eat during the talk if you're really, really hungry. I will not be mad at you, don't worry. So I'm on a category page. In this category, I've got a lot of recipes. On the mobile version, what I want to have is maybe some filters. They are hidden by default, and when I click on the toggle button, then we have the filters full screen. To build that on bigger screens, what we usually do is, okay, you take the filter, you keep it on the left, and then you have the content on the right. So you go from one column to usually do two columns. This is kind of the basic. Let's say that we do that at 980 pixels. So this is the primary breakpoint. It's usually those breakpoints you see in the Bootstrap or Material UI or things like that, where they have these super big main breakpoints. So your grid, your content choreography, those will define those primary media query breakpoints. And what they do, basically, they trigger major changes in your layout, like what I just showed you, coming from one column to two columns and the other way around. So if you're lucky, most designers then will provide you the components at two different versions, a small one for mobile, a big one for desktop. And that's basically usually what we do. So what happens with that? Let's say, okay, then I'm going to use the small version here on the left for the mobile version, and then I'm going to use the big version of this component here on the right on the, let's call this desktop, even if I'm not super fan of that. Yeah, in the big view. All right, then it's done, right? Most of the time you say, yeah, okay, good. But what actually happened in those in-betweens kind of gets a little bit messy. So if we have only like two versions of this component, two different layouts, and we say, okay, that's the mobile version on the left, then what happens with a viewport that's almost the one that we triggered the second version, but not yet. So we have this component that is going to stretch. It's quite ugly, and then the image is a little bit messed up, and if you're not lucky, then it will not be cropped properly and things like that. So this is usually when you have this concept of secondary breakpoints. So secondary breakpoints, they are used to adapt the design at component level. So usually what I tell people is it's easier to decide those in the browsers when actually the content breaks, hence breakpoint, in the components. So if I use those secondary breakpoint for my really nice pizza teaser, this is what it could look like. So now I have my design in 3 different viewport sizes. So small, medium, and large. If I put that in a browser, maybe I will use the small version for the mobile or the smaller screens. Then the medium version will be triggered at this secondary breakpoint, which is 650 pixels. And here you see, I still don't have the major breakpoint. I'm still into this kind of 1-column layouts. And then maybe I will also have this a third breakpoint for this component, which will be basically saying 820 pixels, something like that. And if I have the main, like, biggest view, then what happens is actually here I have my media query that is going my main, like, primary media query triggering the layout, plus this one that was triggered before on 820 pixel to change the component to this kind of large version of the component. So, okay, how do we take such design decisions? This is when we're going to talk about content modeling. So content modeling is a really fancy name to say I will write down everything that is going to be part of my component. So if I do a content model of this recipe teaser, I need an image, I need a title, I have categories somewhere at the top, I have some rating, I have the number of votes here, I have a small excerpt to tell you a little bit what it's about. Then I have a save button, which you could argue it's on itself its own components and has an icon and a button. And then I have this metadata on the right, which are kind of key value, key value, key value. And I have this invincible thing where I have one action on the whole tile, which is going to open the recipe, and a second action that will be on the save. So why do you usually do content modeling? Because first, it helps make sure I don't forget about anything. So this is an easy one. It's a cooking recipe. Most of the time, I'm not working on cookie recipe. I'm working on super complicated data-heavy interfaces for an investment bank. So if I'm not going to list the content that is going to go into my components, there's a good chance that I might miss a big part of that. And I'm usually not doing that alone. Most of the time, I'm working on the business with my business analyst, because it's basically the person who knows the most about the business and what kind of content we are going to need. Also, this kind of things usually help also my developers understand the model, what's going to happen here. So it will help them know the different type of content that I will want to display. And maybe they will also already kind of know that some of this content is not coming from the same API, so they might have to discuss with other departments in order to get that content, things like that. And also it helps them usually do understanding the relationship, because here I've got one recipe teaser, but at some point the category is going to have a content model, maybe the metadata and things like that. So it's really about mapping how complex your content can be and how it's going to work together. Why do you do that? Because you want to prioritize. You want to take design decision about what is going to be super big on the screen, what is going to be small, what do you put at the top of the screen or at the top of the component, things like that. So let's talk about setting content priority in terms of going on a trip. We are going on a trip to the US, so it's a long flight. And usually when you go on a long flight trip, you can have 3 types of luggages. First, you have your hand luggage. Your hand luggage is usually quite small, and your hand luggage is something you will always have next to you. It's the small one that is going to go under your seat. So this is usually where you put your most important content in your hand luggage. It's your passport, it's your ID, it's your credit card, it's your phone, maybe it's your headset, things like that, things that you are actually going to need through all the trip. Then you usually are also allowed to get cabin luggage. So cabin luggage is a little bit tricky. It's small, but not as small as what you need to put under your seat. Also, there's a chance that if the plane is overcrowded, they will put this cabin luggage in the hold. Why, I'm not sure, but still. So usually here you put the things that you will need the most when you land, in case they kind of lose your luggage, that you put the checked-in luggage, things like that. So you put maybe an extra pair of underwear, things like that, a towel, toothbrush, stuff kind of you don't need during the whole trip, but you're going to need pretty quickly afterwards. And then there's what you put in the hold, like the checked-in luggage. Usually it's all of your clothes, things like that. It's also items that, in case of emergency, in case the company is losing your luggage, believe me, it happens, then it's not such a big deal. You might be able to buy some new clothes, or you might be able to wait a few days before they will bring it back to you. So it's a little bit the same with our design. Usually you'll have this super important content that all of your users need all the time, that is super important, versus like the one that can be put on the hold. So how do you decide what's going to go into your luggage and what's going to go into your hold? Well, you do your homework. So this is why you do user research, because you need to really understand how those users are going to interact with that content in able to be to build the most efficient components. So if I go back to my example, what do I put in under my seat? I want a picture, because it's a cooking recipe website, and no one is going to click on that recipe if there's not a really nice fancy picture. Then I want the title. Obviously, we need to know what this recipe is about. Also, something that might be super interesting to have at the top and always there is reviews. We are creatures of habits, we are social creatures, and there's a lot of bias that go through those reviews. So I could talk about the cognitive bias during 2 hours if you want afterwards. But basically what those reviews say is two things. Is like, okay, other people really like this recipe, maybe I should totally check it. And actually there's also a lot of people who simply clicked on it and vote to say, okay, I like it. So it's kind of a way to say this recipe might be super interesting, actually. And then what do I put to the hold? Well, in this case, and this is the reason why it's not on the small version of the component, the metadata on the right, because this is the kind of thing that will be more interesting maybe a little bit later once I've chosen if I'm going to do this recipe or something like that. So again, think wisely before showing some content and not showing some content for specific screen sizes. You want to do some research, otherwise you will end up with marketing people who say something with another person and another stakeholder who thinks something, and it will become a debate of opinion, and usually those debates don't go towards user needs, just towards what people prefer on a personal level. So you're not going to build really great components with that kind of attitude. So how about we try to reuse now this component for different layouts as well? So let's try to build this automagic ideal component layer that is able to adapt to a lot of different things. So quick introduction. We've been speaking a lot the past few years about design system and the concept of modular design. So when I started working like 10 years ago, we used to do those Photoshop mockups where you build one page and then another page. And then if you're lucky and you're nice to your developer, you're going to build those pages in 2 different sizes, and that's it. Today, we tend to go towards more building reusable components instead of building completely the interface completely page by page, and towards working, having those components work together in what we call those design systems. So my little pizza components, is there a way I could kind of reuse this elsewhere and not only on the mobile version? Well, maybe at some point in my website, I want to have some pages with recipe themes like, oh, it's going to be summer, I want to do salads, or, oh, it's almost Halloween, let's do a 20 recipes that are fun and orange to eat and stuff like that. So we could imagine having one of those pages and actually using the small version of the components more as kind of a trendy card where user can click on it and then have all of those recipes. You could imagine that you have a blog on top of this cooking website where you want to promote products because you need advertisement revenues and stuff like that. So in this blog, you have a sidebar that is usually between 300 and 400 pixels wide. Well, why not use the mobile version of the component in the sidebar as well. Then on the recipe page, what about using the same component, but this time using it actually in a slider? Because at the end of the page, if the person didn't like this recipe, you don't want them to go out of your website. You want to provide those related items so they stick around. So how about using this as a card again in this kind of slider? So there's a lot of ways actually I could reuse this component and not just only to have kind of a mobile optimization. Concrete example is Sarenza's website. So they were super smart when they built this website. The filters on the mobile version is exactly the same as the desktop. Basically, the filters were built mobile first. So on mobile, they are full screen. So they're hidden by default. You click on a button and then they open full screen. But here you see there's no difference between those two. It's basically what they do. They have this full screen filters on mobile, and then on desktop, what they do, they assign a size to the filters, and they put it in float left, and then the rest of the website is just like floating on the right. So this is a smart thing. Like if you are going to need to build a sidebar, like filter or something at some point, it might be interesting because usually the sidebar have the same size as what you are going to need on the mobile. So maybe you can kind of make sure that your sidebar is already working on mobile when you're building it so that you don't have that much thing to adapt in the end. So how do you make sure you can build those robust reusable components? Again, content modeling. Fun fact, my MacBook really wanted me to change this into content yodeling. So I don't know if there's any people from Switzerland that really like the idea of content yodeling. I will not yodel, but still. So content modeling. Let's take an example that's a little bit easier than my super big teaser. Let's talk about my clients. And so working for an investment bank, we have things that we call operations. And we needed to build at some point a list of those operations in the interface. So the first thing I did is like basically, again, this kind of content modeling. What's an operation link? Oh, so an operation has a name, it has an ID number, and we identify operation with a special icon so that users can see really quickly what type of content this is. And you don't see it here, but actually this also has an action link, which will, when user click on it, open the detailed operation. Step 2. Are they variation or other contents that could use the same components? So in my case, there actually were. When digging a little bit, I discovered that at some point, I also needed to do some list of contracts and some list of counterparts. And contracts and counterparts actually have the exact same content models. They have a name, they have a cute little icon, which is different, and they have a sort of identification. So here you see it's not the same exact format. Here we have an hyphen, it's not the same number, but it's the same thing. In the end, they have an identification number. So I can reuse the same component I had for this operation and can reuse it for contracts and for counterparts. So now what I want to do is identify where those reusable where those components will be reused. First thing first, I was designing those lists. At some point in the interface, we have a list of bookmarks where a user can basically bookmark any contract operation or counterpart they want. So this component can be used into those small little cards into the bookmark list. And then on the home page, what I have is a quick search, and it's a little bit complex, but users can usually search for anything. And what happens is as soon as we have 3 digits, we try to bring back the 5 most accurate or interesting results. So we have some Elasticsearch behind that. And this is exactly the same component I can reuse because I want to bring here operation, contracts, and counterparts as well. So the same component is going to be used in the tile and then in some kind of dynamic search results. And then I was thinking, okay, but this search is not only super big on the home screen. I also have this search in a lot of pages in the header. But here this time, this search is 360 pixel wide and not like 800 or 900 like on the home page. So what happens here is, again, I can reuse this component, but this time I need a smaller version of that. So from one component, which was my operation link component, I have three variation, operation, contract, counterparts, and I have two different sizes, and I'm actually able to reuse that through my whole interface in a lot of different places. So my advice here, if you do this kind of exercise, and as a designer, usually you know what's in your sketch files or in your wireframes, so try to list it, document it somewhere, somehow, so that the developer actually know whether when they are going to build a component, that this component is going to be used there, and there, so that they can actually build it the most flexible way they could. So let's talk about implementation. How could you, or could we build those things? So from ideal condition in designing tools to what's going to happen in the browser. A really amazing woman called Jen Simons gave a talk in 2018. The talk was called Everything You Know About Web Design Just Changed. And she was talking about this notion of intrinsic web design. So to give you a definition, the idea behind that is, instead of changing styles based on the size of a viewport or how big the screen of the device is, content automatically lay themselves out based on their own ideal conditions. So to translate that, it's to say, okay, my job as a designer is to show my developer this kind of ideal condition. That's what I did when I was designing this recipe in 3 different sizes. This is never gonna look like that in a browser. It's kind of an ideal condition, and this an ideal layout I want to go towards. And then usually I have discussion with the developers on how actually this will adapt in the browser. So there's some really, really cool thing you can actually do in the browser today with Flexbox. So here we have one layout, one component, which is a form that is able to adapt. I really hope you see the videos, to 4 different layouts. So stacked, then we have this half. Now we have like 2 fields on left and right, and then just only one line. And the cool thing about that is there's not a single media query to build that. All of that is done with Flexbox, with grow, shrinks, and all of those properties. So this demo is by Adam Argyle, and if you say able to do a component that is adapting automatically here to the screen size because the component was full screen, it means that if I take this component and I display it in a small container, it's going to look like that. In a medium container, it's going to look like that. Then big container, I trigger another layout, and super wide container, I trigger the 4th layout. And again, not a single media query. That's why it's working actually. It's just adapting to whatever environment it has. And yes, you can do my little 3 pizza pan example exactly with this technique. So if you're curious, like Geoffrey Croft kind of as a challenge built me the component. So the idea is, again, it's not exactly what I designed, but oh crap, sorry, it's pretty close. I have my components in a small, medium, and large version. And here again, I just took the same component, no media query, in 3 different container size, and it was able to magically adapt. So what you need to understand today is there's a lot of things you can do with all of those new cool technology like Flexbox, free layouts. There's also like Clamp, you have Min, Max, and you can use Calc. So if you're curious about how to build those components in a really, really flexible way that's not only adapting towards media query and screen size, but more like interesting layout, you can take a look at just Google for responsive web design without media queries, and you will find a ton of articles. So what we can do is the one on the left. So here you see there's not a lot of big changes, actually. The layout is changing a little bit, but of course, with this kind of techniques, I can't really have what I wanted at the beginning, which is having kind of one content that's not displayed on the small version, plus having the save here floating around on top of it. So this, unfortunately, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it will be quite technically challenged to build that at the moment. So to build that, you would need something that doesn't really exist yet, which is container queries. And it used to be called element queries. So media queries is basically a tool that lets you kind of change the layout based on the viewport size. I know it goes beyond that. You can check for density and other stuff, but to keep it simple, let's say we change the layout with media queries based on viewport size. The idea behind the people who want to have container query is to say, okay, then let's kind of take the syntax of media query, and instead of changing the layout based on a viewport size, we want to change the layout and check for a parent or a container and adapt my component based on the parent and the container, like with height or whatever. So there's a lot of discussion about that. As I said, there were some proposals and then they changed. They called it element query, then container queries. But at the moment, we don't really have them. But there's still some stuff we can do technically, but it requires a lot of JavaScript. So Philip Walton did this really fun demo. I took the video in the browser so that you see that I'm not actually resizing the browser. So we have two components. And what I'm doing is I'm resizing the parents. So on the right side, the parent of the card is getting bigger. On the left side, the parent of the calendar is getting smaller. So here, what it's basically doing is implementing what I was proposing, but as container queries. It's just that you need some JavaScript, and his solution is heavily based on resize observers. So I put all of the link. You'll get the slides by tomorrow, I think. So if you want to check the demo, you will be able to check them later. So my message here is basically, we can do a lot of things, like technically, whether you're using Flexbox or JavaScript or other things. The problem usually is that most designers, they're still obsessed with pixel perfection. And I'm saying designers, but honestly, I had POs, I had head of products who were asking why the final product is not exactly the same pixel perfect image of what we were doing in Sketch. So for me, we need to stop obsessing over this kind of pixel perfection. Like, what's important is the final product, is not your really fancy sketch files. And we need to embrace this kind of fluid, interesting nature of the web. So I would say designing tools, whatever you want, Sketch, XD, Figma, Photoshop if you want, or even Illustrator, I don't care. But designing tools, decide in the browser. And this is where you really need to have a strong relationship with your developers, because sometimes what you're going to design for those components might not be completely possible. So you have to come back and discuss a lot about what we can do. Another thing we need to be careful when we design components is to kind of think beyond those happy path and perfect content. So most of the time we have the happy path. So here you go. Okay, thanks, bye. You've got your components. But what if? What if I have 2 lines of text? Well, okay, you say, it's easy. You put 2 lines of text, Stephanie. Yeah, okay. But what do I do with the right part? Do I keep the same padding here? Do I keep it at the top? Or do I use some Flexbox magic to say, okay, I want to actually center this, and then I have the same automagic padding on the top and at the bottom? I'm not saying any of those is better than the other. I'm just saying this is the kind of question your developer will ask you, like, what's happening when you have 2 lines of content? Something designers love, like, okay, I've designed this perfect the page with all of those styles. They all have the same content height. It's amazing. It looks great. But in real life, you might have like 2 lines, 3 lines, only 1 line. And how does this element stretch? Do we keep the interesting half of the element? But then it means that here you got more white space, and some client may not like all the white space. Or do we say, okay, then let's try to have all of the cards the same height? And well, those who don't have enough content, fat chance, then they'll have a white space here, but it will be inside the card, things like that. Again, I'm not saying one solution is better than the other. I'm just saying this is the kind of question you will get when you design those components. What happens if something is missing, if some content is missing, if I don't have images because my cooking website is actually a community website where a lot of people can propose their recipes. Do I put a placeholder with the logo of my fake cooking website, which is called Cooking? Do I remove the content that is not existing? But then how is the component going to behave? How is it going to stretch? So thanks to Flexbox, this is usually easy to handle today if something is not here that is able to stretch automatically, but it's a design decision you need to take at some point. What happens if we don't have values for some content? Let's say I just posted my gluten-free pizza recipe and I don't have any votes at the moment. Will I do something like that? Say, okay, 0 votes, but 0 stars. Yes, but here, if people don't see the number of votes, they might assume that actually my pizza is not good. So 0 votes doesn't equal 0 stars, actually. It's kind of false. So maybe I should have something that says no rating available at the moment, because there's none. So at least users know that this is a new recipe, there's no rating, and that's why we don't have any stars. Or again, do I remove the missing content? And then how is it going? How is the rest of the content going to get laid out? So a lot of questions. When it comes to content, a few tips. Don't use lorem ipsum. If you use fake content, make sure that the structure of your fake content is close to the real one. Like I'm using a lot of fake content because of security reason. We don't want to have real data on the mockups. So I'm using fake content. You've seen some of my fake content, but actually my fake content has the same structure as what I have in the real content and in the real database. If you're a designer, ask the developer for the limits. Like you have fields that come from a database. It's interesting to know what's the limit in the database. Then it's also interesting to know what people actually filled in. So if I go back to my example with the name of the operation, the database says, I think that we can have 2054 characters, something like that. But actually, at the moment, the longest one we have is 70, and the average is 50 characters, something like that. So it's good to know the limit, but make sure that you don't go into those edge cases as well, and make sure it's actually accurate. If you're a developer, that's what I usually say to my developer. If something is missing, just come and ask me how it should behave, and then we can discuss. Maybe I don't need to design all of that, but at least we'll have a discussion, and you'll know how it's expected to behave. Also, don't forget interactive states. Like when you're designing components, some of those components are read-only, but as soon as you design components the users are going to interact with, there's a lot of things going on. So easiest example, of course, is a form field. Like you have a default, you have hover, you have with, without content, you have the focus, which is when the users either clicks with the mouse or arrives on the field by keyboard navigation. Maybe you want placeholder, this field might be disabled, it might have information error, warning, success, all of that. So there's a lot of different things when interacting with those components. And it's designer's job to know and to design all of those states, or at least to make sure that they communicate those states to the developer. Then let's talk about data population. Again, on the right, my successfully loaded happy path component. But some stuff might go wrong while loading the content of this component. So in my interface, we have a lot of content that come from different API, different services. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time. So if you have those kind of bank UIs or super heavy UI where you have things that are taking time to load, maybe you want to have a loading state for your cards or your components. Also, sometimes we don't have anything to display, and it's not an error. It's not because the backend throws an error at us. It's basically because we don't have content yet. For example, if I'm into an operation that was just created, there's a good chance that at the moment I don't have any contracts for this operation. So I will have this contract tag that says there is no contract to display, something like that. And also sometimes things might go wrong, especially when you get a data or content that comes from a third part. And it's perfectly okay to have problems sometimes, but at least tell the user that there's an error. It's not that this content doesn't exist. It exists. We kind of think it exists. It's just that we were not able to load it. So try to find ways if the user can correct things. So usually it's like, okay, try to refresh the page or something. What might happen for my components is that another department is deploying their tool. So while they are deploying, this specific tile is not available to my users because the content comes from someone who is currently deploying, things like that. So make sure you tell the user when there's an error and how they might correct it, if there's a way to correct it. And then what happens if I have only one item? If I have a lot of items? It's like I designed a happy path with 5. Okay, what if I have 15 or like 30 different items? Do I have a pagination? Do I have a scroll bar? Do I have a components that will have 15 items of operation contracts and counterpart into it? So all of those things are a question that my developer will ask me when I will show him or her this perfect version with 5. Like my developer will most definitely say, okay, but Stephanie, users can actually bookmark more than 5 things. So what do we do then? It's like, okay, snap, let me come back to you. Things like that. So again, I don't need to design all of them. Here, what we will say is like, okay, Eugene, you know what? We have this pagination components. What happens is basically you put the pagination components. So the idea of a design system is, of course, to be able to reuse things. So if you've already designed some of that stuff, maybe you don't need to design all of those components, or maybe you just do like I do know that I have a super big design system in Sketch. I just drag and drop the pagination component and done. I've basically done it in 5 minutes, so it's nice. But the idea is really try to know what's going to happen and communicate with the development team. So to think behind Happy Path, know where the data comes from, ask your developers, investigate the amount of data that might get displayed, and also investigate what might go wrong with this data. So again, usually your developer will know where it comes from, how much it can be, how long it can be, and what might go wrong with their APIs, things like that. So just go ask, have a conversation. One thing that usually helps me when I'm designing complex components, I don't want to miss any of those non-happy paths, is actually to map the path. So this is mapping of the different steps. So some people could call that task flow, some people call that user flow. I tend to call it user flow at the moment, but basically the idea behind that is to say, okay, what's the different steps my users is going to go through when they are going to do a new search. And here you see I've already like yes and no thingy where I say, do I have content? Yes, no. If I don't, I do a new search. And then on the search result, if I have content or if I have this search result page, if I don't, I have a no result page. But even if I have content, then I have filters on the search result page. And what might happen is when users is filtering, they might not get any results anymore because they put too many filters. And at the moment, we don't have the capability to tell you how many results you will have based on the filters. You know, some e-commerce do that. They say, okay, if you click on this category, you'll only have 20 results. Technically, we can do that at the moment. So there's a chance that if you play around with too many filters, you'll get no results. So it means that I'm out of this happy path with search results, and I need to design this page with my components that doesn't have any results, or maybe that only has 1, or maybe that will have 1,000 results because this is a super broad search and the users didn't put any filters, things like that. So actually mapping the path obviously kind of helps you think beyond this kind of happy path. Last but not least, how about building adaptive systems that will be able to adapt towards users' contexts? So it would be about kind of listening to the environment and learning user patterns. It's about combining some smart device sensor data, network connectivity, analysis of user behavior, maybe some big data or machine learning to build something that is going to adapt on its own. So usually when you talk about adapting the layout to the user context, the first thing you think about is those kind of interfaces where you have a step-by-step. So this is a mobile application for people who want to bring their car to repair outside of opening hours. So there's a lot of stuff going on. You need to go to the garage. Then you need to get first step the code of the gate to open it. Then you have to park the vehicle. There's some documents to sign, things like that, especially if you want to have a rental car so that you can actually go back home without your car. You need to pick up the key of the rental. You need to drop the key of your car, stuff like that. So it's actually the same page, and the components are pretty close in terms of content, but each one of those is one step further into the whole process. At some point, the client wanted us to adapt the layout to GPS location. We kind of refused. So let me explain you why. So what they wanted is like basically to say, okay, what we could have is we locate the user while he's driving, okay? And if the user is, I don't know how many meters close to the garage, then we pop up a notification on the screen of their phone, say, showing them the code of the garage. We said, okay, but you might have some problems. For instance, do you really want to have something that pops on the screen of someone who is currently driving? So maybe it's not always such a good idea to have these kind of things. But anyway, you could imagine, so adapting those components to the different steps in a process where the users are currently. Then we could imagine using device sensors to adapt to user environment. For instance, GPS application. When the users are in a tunnel, the app detects that it's a tunnel based on GPS, but also sometimes based on the brightness in the car. And then usually, so those GPS app, what they do, they switch to dark mode automatically. So if you have a bike rental app, usually when you are before the bike rental, what you want to see is what are the bike stations around me and how many bikes do they have? Because if they have 0, then I can't really rent a bike. While riding, most of the time, what you're interested into is how many parking space there are at the bike station so that I can actually bring back my bike. In Luxembourg, it's really fun because we have a big hill. So it's basically like all of the parking station at the top of the hill at a certain hour of the day. They don't have any bikes anymore because everybody is going from the top of the hill to the train station. But then at the train station, there's no parking space anymore. So when you do that, you want to make sure that actually, if you're going to the parking next to the train station, maybe you want to be sure that you pick one where there's actually some space where you can leave your bike before taking your train. Arguably, you might want to see both when your bike is broken and you want to bring it to a station where you want to put it and pick another bike. So there's always this kind of cases where you might not think about it when you are actually designing it, but then you have a friend who uses the service or an actual user, and when you do user interview, you discover that, maybe we need all 3 of those. Then last but not least, something quite experimental that would be adapting to user needs and expectation across the journey. If we're talking about boarding pass, so boarding pass on a mobile phone, usually if you're into what we call pre-trip, so a few days before your trip, what you're interested into might be, as a user, which airport. If you're living in a city like Berlin, where there's a few different airports and some of those are quite far away from the city, it's quite important to know which airport specifically with airport codes and things like that. Then what's important is maybe the day of the departures, also the boarding time, so that you make sure you don't miss your flight. But let's say you're H1, like 1 hour before your trip. I kind of hope that 1 hour before your trip, as a user, you're at the airport and at the right airport. But then other information are more interesting to you. Like you still want to know the boarding time, but no, maybe terminal and gates are actually more important than the airport. So we could imagine having something like that, like an interface that is adapting the content, which is like basically here, just like the font size, based on the moment, like the point in the user journey. And if you're on a smartwatch, what you would have is something like that, where you have a boarding, terminal, gate, seats, and then if you swipe, you get your QR code. So this is fun experiment. We were a little bit experimenting with that kind of thing when I was working for an airline, but I would be careful with that. And I would heavily, and I insist on the word heavily, test it in usability testing with real users at the airport, because it might go against something we call predictability of the interface. The idea behind predictability of the interface is that as a user, you get used to things are a certain way. You get used to having buttons at the top or the bottom, things like that. So if you start changing the whole interface based on the point in the journey, it might be a little bit confusing for some users. So I kind of like the idea of experimenting with these sort of things, but again, test it with real users to make sure you're not breaking the experiment. And also for those kind of adaptive features, adaptive components, allow users to go back from those or to manage them. So this is a Google forum where someone is asking how to stop Google Maps to stop selecting walking when I'm nearby another house. So this person is doing delivery, and they're using Google Maps for that. And apparently, if I understood correctly, anytime they are close to the drop, Google Maps switch to the other mode, which makes them waste a lot of time. So it sounds a little bit silly to say, okay, but it's only 10 seconds. But I remind you that most of the people who are doing delivery are tracked. They have super high KPI on how much time it takes them. So sometimes 10 seconds then actually count. So no one knows an interface that knows better than you. So make sure that if you're building this kind of things, there's a way for the users to go back to another version or to switch it off or things like that, because you don't want to take the control of their device. So again, you need to deeply understand your user needs and behavior to build these kind of things, and build adaptive experience by doing user research. One thing I like to do when doing user research to build this kind of features is user journeys. So the idea of a user journey is you're going to map all of the different phases of a journey, and for each phases you can map a lot of things. What I would be interesting for my journey for the boarding pass would be the different action. Like phase 1, pre-trip, action would be I need to go to the airport, basically. Phase 2 would be in-trip, the day of the trip, or in-trip 1 hour before departure, things like that. Action is I need to find my gate. Emotion might not be super interesting at this point, or maybe they could, but also like touch points. Is this person going to use a mobile phone, smartwatch? Are they going to print the boarding pass at home? Are they going to use the smart boards into the airport to print those boarding pass as well? Things like that. And you could use machine learning and big data. I'm not a super fan of big data, but this is something you could also use to predict user behavior. So at the moment, if you're searching for reproduction rates on Google, so I did this search, I was not logged in, and I was in Chrome in private mode, but I kind of think the private mode of Chrome is not that private. So reproduction rate at the moment, the results, if you take a look, I have most of the results are linked to epidemiology results because of the COVID-19 at the moment, because a lot of people are actually hearing about this reproduction rate, what's R, R0, RTF, something like that, and they want to have information about that. Well, the demography results, which is a reproduction rate in a population about which is more linked to demographic and kids and stuff like that. These results, I only have 2 of those. So I'm pretty sure if I had done this research maybe 1 year ago, I'm not sure that I would have that many epidemiological results. So what happened here is big data, machine learning, and Google is adapting the search result based on maybe location, but also what other users are looking for. So to sum it up, to build those kind of interfaces, we need to think beyond screen size and like arbitrary mobile sizes and make sure that we are going to adapt our components to layouts and the content. Build reusable components that can lay themselves out based on their own ideal condition. So Flexbox, grid layout, all of this stuff. Design beyond happy path and happy content because, yeah, it might be easy, but most of the time, your content is never going to be as perfect as you had it in your design files. And conduct user research, understand content modeling and information architecture to take those design decisions. And last but not least, it's a collaborative process. So it should be done usually with a lot of collaboration with your developer team. And that's it. I don't know if I've lost Jean-François. No, he's back.
Hey.
Did
you hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just said that there was some question in Q&A part, so I think you can go directly on it and start to answer people.
Right. Yeah, okay. I can do it like that. Hey, so do I need to take them like the one at the top? Yeah. What about A/B testing? Is A/B testing useful for me? Tough question. Currently, no, because I'm working for an investment bank and I'm not allowed to use cloud tools, and most of those A/B testings are stuff you usually implement with cloud tools that you put on top of your current website. So at the moment, it's not really useful for me. I honestly never did any A/B testing at a component level, but most of the time you are doing this at really, you are doing it by modifying really small things in a page, for instance. So A/B testing can be interesting to know what converts, what works the most. The problem is you've no idea why it worked. So you're basically like, okay, the button on the top right converts 20% more than the button on the left bottom, something like that. So you know it converts, you don't really know why. So it's a little bit tricky because after that, if you want to build the same component or something that is close, if you don't know why it worked, it might be complicated. So usually what I would advise to people to do if they're doing A/B testing is do A/B testing, but also do some usability research or some ask some question to the users to kind of understand the why behind the data. Because sometimes it might be something as silly as I've heard of A/B testing where one of the version converted better, and actually they also put Hotjar in place. So Hotjar is a tool that lets you actually record your screen, like what are users doing. And this discovered that it converted better because, well, there was a problem with the A/B test, and the button was basically half broken in some of those versions. So you're like, yeah, we know it covers better, but you don't know why. And then they looked at the Hotjar, I was like, oh shit, how did that happen? So yeah, could be useful, but still would be interested to know the why something converts. Also, to do A/B testing, you need a super big audience. Otherwise, you need to run the test for a really long time. Because I know companies who are running A/B testing and then they're running it for a super small amount of time. And as soon as they see one result, they just stop. They're like, oh, okay, we're losing money, stop, or things like that. So it's always really complex to put A/B testing in place in a way that is going to give you like real results that are actually accurate. Then, is professional and academic field literature and external research the only way to learn about cognitive bias, or are there other resources of learning? So from my experience, if you're interested in the field of cognitive bias, usually you're going to want to go towards psychology. So yeah, usually it's a field of psychology. But I don't know if the question is about how do we learn about cognitive bias as designers and the theory behind, or is it kind of how do you know if your users have cognitive bias? So Osama, if you want to clarify the question to make sure I reply to the question the right way. Then about user research, did you do survey with the data the user wants? Jean-François, can you explain your question? I've lost him.
Yes. The question was about when you are asking you are doing your user research. That are available to the users and to determine to know what are the more pertinent for the UI.
You mean like
doing some survey to record what?
I'm not sure I understand. I'm sorry. Like if you have a component with a lot of data, do you do the research with all of the data and ask users what's not useful to them?
Yes.
It depends. Sometimes I'm a little bit evil. So sometimes I would do that, but the problem is then asking directly people in my field, I've seen that sometimes they're a little bit biased, and especially for my current users, we are migrating a super big interface. They're super used to it. They've invested a lot of time. So if I'm going to ask them if they need the content, there's a big chance that they might say yes, just in case I might remove it and one day they might need it. So asking them is usually a bit tricky, but sometimes we do it the other way around. We go for the minimum amount of content possible, and we're like, okay, we know we're missing half of this contents. Let's test it, and let's see if our users are saying, actually, we're missing that, or yeah, you know what, I couldn't perform my task because I'm missing this information and this information. So in the current context I have, where again, redesigning a big interface where user will need to migrate to the new version, for me, it's easier to say, okay, let's remove content on purpose, maybe even remove content I know they need to kind of have this kind of double check and see how many people are saying, oh, this content is missing, versus then showing them the whole amount. And then they're like, oh, yeah, we really, really need that. And then when you look at the data, we're not using Google Analytics, we're using, I don't remember the name of the one we're using, but it's self-hosted Matomo. It used to be called Piwik, and I can't remember the name. But sometimes when you use that, you take the statistics, you ask people, are you visiting these pages and these pages? And they say, yeah, you visit them a lot. And when you look at the data, actually, they're not really doing it. So it's always a little bit tricky when you're doing user research, because if you're asking them direct questions about the interface, there's a lot of bias that come into place. There's also, maybe they just used the feature this morning. So they're like, yeah, this is super important. But then when you ask how often a year do you actually use this page, or do you actually use this button? They're like, actually, we're doing this thing only in May when there's loan grading, and then, actually, I need it twice a year. So it's always a little bit complicated. Okay, next question.
Usama precise question in the chat.
Wait, I need to click on
Usama
chat.
precise.
Yay.
Yes.
Well, usually cognitive biases, there's a lot of those, so you need to be aware of those. So it's funny because you kind of learn all of those cognitive biases through literature, through different things. We created 52 cards game with cognitive biases, where we selected basically the ones that might kind of, how do you say, impact your user research the most. So now I'm pretty good at detecting those. So usually, yeah, literature, some podcasts talk about cognitive science. There's a lot of great blogs about psychology. So not only in HCI being human-computer interaction field, but also in different fields about user-centric design and how do you say, psychology. But once you've learned about this bias, the fun part, I would say, is that you're actually able to detect those during your user research. So there's a bandwagon effect, which is basically people tend to follow the crowd. So, you know, when you're on booking website and the the thumbnail is saying, oh, 24 people are currently looking at this room. So they're trying to create two things. There's a scarcity, which is basically, oh my God, 24 people. If I'm not going to book this one right now, I'm not going to have this room. And then there's the bandwagon effect, which is, other people are interesting. Maybe they know something that I don't know. So I'm going to follow the lead and do the same as they do. And we had that on an interface where we basically asked for user feedback, and it was really not a good idea, but we did it kind of by image. So we have release, and this was into a release note, and we said, okay, we have that new thing, and that new thing. And for a few days, we didn't have any feedback from our users. And then all of a sudden, one person replied to all. I love replies to all, and said, yeah, I really don't like it because there's a lot of white space, and I could see everything in the old interface, and now I need to scroll to see things. And then it's like +1 button on Facebook or LinkedIn. Then I have another one say, oh, actually, I agree with him. And oh, yeah, I agree with him. So then we had a chain of email of people agree with him. So we actually had a one-on-one with that person, and we showed him some alternative version with less white space and things like that. So we really tried to take this feedback into account, because this is our main user group, and we don't want them to not use it. Otherwise, it would be super complicated to keep on with this project. And when talking to him, he admitted that he just looked at the new interface. He didn't even use it, and it was different from the old one. And he thought there was too much white space, but know that he's kind of played around with it. It's kind of okay-ish. But it's really, really funny, because this whole bandwagon effect of all of the people jumping on the bandwagon, this, I don't know if you know this expression. It was basically that those emails yeah, me too, and I don't like the white space. So it's really, really, really funny. So once you're kind of familiar with some of those biases, the interesting thing is you can mitigate some of those. For instance, there's a bias called social desirability, which is when you ask people a question, they tend to give the most socially acceptable answer. So if you want to use this, mitigate this kind of bias, what you can do, for instance, is anonymous surveys, because then they can't be identified, and there's a chance that they may be kind of more honest, especially on touchy subjects, than if you were asking the question one-on-one and the people could be identified or things like that. Yeah, Matomo is the tool I'm using. Thank you. So how do you take into account OS browser zoom? That's a good question. It's more of a technical question, actually, I think. Or Windows zoom. Yeah, the 125 I know about, because actually I've got that on my computer on my client side. But usually OS browser zoom is something that we try to take into account when we're testing. So we are trying to make sure that when you zoom in, zoom out the interface, it's not going to get broken. But honestly, we don't do anything specific when we design. It's mostly a technical question about making sure you use AMs or RAMs units. So this is more for my developer most of the time. Also, I'm currently in an environment where we all have the same computer, but some people have different scaling level in Windows because it's those like super high definition laptops, but you actually have to zoom the text to be able to read anything. But I don't think it's impacting our interfaces that much. From what I've seen, I've tried different zoom levels, and it's basically zooming down or up the whole interface. So then if the components are responsive, plus built with EMs or Ms and RAMs, then usually it adapts pretty good. So next question, is there a way to nicely downgrade a chart presentation by simplifying data or even, it moved, by simplifying data or even presentation based on the space we are given to display it? I'm pretty sure you have something super specific in mind, but without seeing the chart, it might be a little bit complicated. So it depends. I have ideas because I've done that with some of the charts we have, but yeah, it really depends. Sometimes you just kind of zoom out. I don't know how to explain. I would need to show you some interface. But basically, you kind of remove some of the stuff around it. So if it's a pie chart, for instance, you might want to not have that many little levels of details. So if you have a scale that says like, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, maybe in responsive, in smaller one, you will say, okay, 1, 5, 10 to kind of have less visual noise, because if you like shrink those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, it might be a little bit complicated, but that works for pie chart, not pie chart, bar charts. But if you're working with pie charts, at some point, it gets super heavy. So maybe at some point, what you can do is having a switch to show the raw data. We have that on some interface. The users have the choice between seeing the graphs or just seeing the raw data. Also, I think some libraries scale down responsively pretty nicely. 3D charts, something. I'm super bad at name, but I can connect with me afterwards, and I can maybe send you a few of those libraries. But yeah, usually it's a tough question. It's one by one, component by component, depending of the data that you need in those charts. So next question, what did you think about dealing with full analytics user research? I mean, did you already try to do some visual analysis of users to remove part of your UI? I think it's the same question you asked before, Jean-François. Or do you mean in Google Analytics?
Yes, it was doing the user research based on things like Google Analytics or tools like that.
The thing is, in Google Analytics, you don't really have kind of, I don't think you have version of the
But
UI
I was
of removing parts.
thinking about things like, I was most thinking about things like Hotjar. I think is how do the right name,
Yeah.
the right pronunciation. The tools that you are using to. So I'm asking me if you are using user research with tooling like that.
So
you have a kind of raw version of your UI. And you are doing a first analysis, and then you are starting to really do your job.
Honestly, I would love to do more quantitative research like that, but first I can't because Hotjar is not self-hosted and I can't use cloud tools. I'm quite limited at the moment, but I used to be able to use Hotjar with other clients, and we also use the storytelling something, same as Hotjar, just other UI. but we were mostly looking at conversion in like sign-up forms, things like that. So the complicated parts about if you want to do that is whether it's Hotjar or any other tool where you're basically looking at what our users are doing, is you can't really compare one user. You can't say, okay, this is one version, and the same user, then you give it another version, because it's basically anonymized users. So you can't really kind of compare two different UI with the same person. It's a little bit tricky, I think, unless it's a tool where user needs to be logged in, and then you can actually see the account and kind of see how it's changing and things like that. So for this kind of thing, I would more go into real like usability testing, being able to gather quantitative feedback, like discussing with the users again about what's missing and how it's behaving on different screen sizes and things like that. So I'm not quite sure you could automatize this kind of thing. It's more about, going out there with a version of the interface. We're doing a lot of that actually with what we have at the moment, which is we have usually MVP of the component, which will be component in the most raw version, and then we give user a task. We ask them to perform the task. So what you can do if you really want to have quantitative data, there's a lot of KPI you can do, like how many errors do they do, how long does it take to accomplish the task, do they accomplish it at all, things like that. You can have like rage clicks, stuff like frustrating, where users think they can click, so they click, but actually they can't, things like that. So what I would usually do is we test an MVP version of the component, then we iterate on it, and then maybe we change the component a little bit, and then we go back to the users with a second version and maybe a third, but usually we don't have time for third versions. So if we had unlimited budget, it would be amazing to do that a lot. But at the end of the day, I also think you need to trust your designers and make sure that, they're doing user research, but you can't spend all of the budget into that. So at some point, you still need to kind of take a decision. Good. Okay. What was there a time you worked on a project where different content was displayed dynamically according to the user's level of competency and comfort? A mobile application. Yes, that's an example of a question. Okay, I'm joking around. So was there, I'm joking around because I could answer yes to this question and go to the next one. So that's an example of the kind of question you don't want to ask users in usability testing, because you don't want to ask them a question that they can answer by yes or no. So yes, there was a time I worked on a project with different content where we displayed then dynamically, where we had kind of beginners, and after a few kind of not days, but a few weeks of use, we kind of changed it for another mod. But they could also always go back to the previous mod if they needed to. I think video games are actually doing a lot of good stuff when it comes to adapting the interface to this kind of user competency level of comfort or proficiency also. It's like most of the time you get this kind of onboarding. Like I've been playing Dauntless, which is I don't even know how to describe this. There's too many stuff going on there, but it's kind of a first person where you can go on hunt with other people, and you're basically sent by PNGs to gather some stuff. And the first time they just like throw you there, and you don't really know what's happening. But then as you kind of explore the world, you've got new possibilities, you've got things that got unlocked that you couldn't access before. And it's quite interesting to also see the UI around the user actually evolving and around this kind of things. So I think if you want a great example of really interfaces that really nicely adapts to the user context. Video games is a cool one. This video game actually is really, really nice for two things. First, it's one of the only video games I know that you can play online on PC, Xbox, PS4 on the same server, which is quite great. And the other cool thing is when you're playing on a PC, when you're using the mouse, when it detects you're using the mouse, the interface looks something like one way, basically mouse optimized. And then if you're plugging into a controller, you can use your Xbox or PS4 controller, then the interface is changing. But then if you use the mouse again, even if the PS computer is plugged in, then the interface kind of changes again. So it's quite interesting to see how they found a way to really smoothly do to transition between what controller the user is currently using, between mouse or PS controller, and it's actually quite nice and not disturbing at all. So yeah, I think there's kind of interesting ways to do that, to kind of onboard users to more features when they discover new things in your interface, especially if it's something super complex. And if you think about Adobe products, for instance, I think they have these workspaces where you know when you install Illustrator, that's the last one I was installing, you've got those basics, which is kind of, there's not too many windows on your screen, like you have only the basics. And then if you want to explore a little bit further because you are kind of a super powerful users and you need some of those features, you know, they exist, then you can add those to the screen. So yeah, there's quite a lot of cool things you can do. Next question about loading screen. Did you design different loading area to avoid layout shift? No, at the moment, what we have is basically min height on the container. And yeah, we will have loading shift because there's no way to know in advance how big the content is going to be, because we're fetching a lot of different APIs. So based on the content, we could maybe at some point say, okay, this component is going to be approximately at least this height and this height. So we could have kind of a different loading areas based on what we expect the content to be. But at the moment, nope. Is it possible to share a presentation? Yeah, sure. No, I'm just thinking about how I will present. I was thinking about sharing the presentation when the slides when the video will be online on YouTube, and putting like the presentation links to different demos and interesting links in the on top of that, plus the YouTube video on a blog post. So yeah, it will depend when the video will be uploaded, but normally, yeah, sure, I will share the presentation on my blog. Must a designer consider JS disabled browser when she builds the design? Not sure it's a designer's job to consider JS disabled browsers. I think it's a discussion that needs to happen more with developers. Honestly, it's a tough question, because then we need to talk about progressive enhancement versus graceful degradation and things like that. So for me, it should be a trigger that the developer tells the designer, okay, your component looks nice, but we can't really do that without JavaScript. So how might it degrade, or how might it look like if the JavaScript is not available or enabled in the browser, or if simply the JavaScript doesn't load? Might happen at some point. You might have, it's like I have an ad blocker, and sometimes this ad blocker blocks a lot of stuff, especially for like third-party content. Sometimes I don't have images because they come from third-party content, or like I don't have all of the interaction and all of the button because for whatever reason my ad blocker decided this JavaScript was not gonna get loaded. So I'm not only considering like JS disabled browser, but I think it should work-ish without the JavaScript. It doesn't mean that it should work the same way. It doesn't mean at any cost that it should look the same way. It just means that, yes, if the person doesn't have JavaScript or if there's a problem loading the script, they should be able to perform the bare minimum so that they could accomplish the task. It's like if it's a blog, they should be able at least to read the content of the blog without the JavaScript, even if the content is not nicely displayed, all fancy with grids and stuff moving around and the image super responsive and everything. If the task of the user is to come and basically read a blog post, they should be able to do it without JavaScript. But then it's super complicated also at the same time, because, for instance, we're currently rebuilding our interface with Material UI React, which is then a React framework. So if we don't have JavaScript, I honestly don't know what happens to our interface. So I'm lucky because I don't even think users are allowed to kind of disable JavaScript, because we can't do anything on our computers. It's like last week I had a problem. The photo app from Windows didn't work anymore, and the guy could not reinstall it because he had to have super admin rules or rights just to be able to open stuff on. It was a nightmare. So yeah, it really, really depends. But at least have some sort of content that load would be nice with JS. So, are there other ways to experiment apart from A/B testing and overclose alpha betas? Depends. What do you want to experiment? I know someone who wrote more than 1,000 pages book on user research. So yeah, there's a lot of way to experiment. Depends what you want to experiment. So tell me what you want to experiment, and maybe I can tell you what kind of tool or UX method you can use. I'm going to take the next question if you want to reply in the chat. So are some physical-based layout engine out there? I mean, based on physics concept like pressure, velocity, friction. If so, are they somewhat usable? I'm not sure I understand the question. What do you mean by pressure, viscosity, and friction? Like, how would you detect that in a browser is my main question. Because basically there's a... Yay!
Works. Okay, thank you. So my question would be like, imagine your content would like to have more space, for instance, do not support pressure for presentation and would like to escape a bit. If you can specify somehow that he has the right to get up a bit or to get down, something like that.
Really?
Sorry, that's a question, I know, but
okay, I thought you really wanted to have kind of a pressure when you touch the screen or things like that, like physical sensors. So no, if you want your layout to escape, there's like you can do a lot of stuff with grid layout is pretty flexible for that. Also, there's a specification around. So we have clamp, min, max, and min, max, which I never remember which one does what. I need to look at the spec each time. But basically, you can say, I want the content. I want this content to stretch until it's at its widest size, something like that. Or I want this content to not stretch, or things like that. So there's actually a lot of different CSS specifications to do this kind of stuff. So I don't think you need an engine to do that. You just need to take a look, to dig a little bit in the new specification of CSS around the clamp, min, max that are also check out Jen Simmons' tutorial. She does a lot of things with a grid layout, and I think she has a whole tutorial where she explains this kind of 3 or 4 layout grid, where one of the grid is basically, she doesn't give it any size. It's just like, okay, you're allowed to take whatever size your content needs to be, something like that.
Yeah,
I can put links in the article about all of those cool grid stuff. But yeah, clump, min, max in CSS.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yes.
Okay, do you see subgrid becoming a viable solution anytime near the future? I've seen a lot of people super happy about subgrids, and I think it's been something that was missing from the specification at the beginning. But there's a lot of work going into specification, so I think at some point you do like a V1, V2, etc. So yeah, I think subgrid will be interesting as soon as you want to have a lot of super complex layouts. But also the thing at the moment is that we are still kind of, I think as designers, constrained by all of those years of designing within a grid. You know, like those 12 column float grids. And I had a headache. I was working with someone who wanted me to put a grid in Sketch, and I was like, yeah, okay, but you like, I'm not putting the different element on the grid. What I'm doing is basically, okay, I want 2 blocks next to each other. So what I do, I take the whole space, I divide it by 2. I know I want a 24 gutter in the middle. So I'm not designing a grid. I'm just saying, okay, I have 2 elements. They take whatever size they need, as long as they have that much margin around them plus the 24 pixel in between, it's fine with me. And we went to super huge argument. Like, he was recruiting designers and he showed me a portfolio. It's like, oh, look, actually, she shows me the grid on her design. This is amazing. I want to hire her. So I think we've been super obsessed with grids, but not like CSS grids, but really those what we could do into floating and stuff like that. And the cool thing with CSS grid layout is actually you can, it's weird to say you can build grid without grids, because when you think about grids, most of people who used to do floats, bootstrap and stuff like that thinks about this 12 column grid, right? But with CSS grid layout, you can build a super big grid and then have elements that look like visually they're kind of outside of the grid, or they're 1/3 on the screen, and then another one is like 1/4 on the other side of the screen, and you can kind of visually break out completely out of what we used to have. And I think with subgrid it will become even more amazing, because then you can again like break out inside this grid, break out of the grid within the grid. So I'm super curious about what people will do with that. And I think it's interesting for designers also to kind of take a look at what people are building with this kind of specs, whether it's Flexbox or grid layout. Maybe you don't need as a designer to understand how to code with a grid layout. Even I need to look at the specification whenever I want to, like cheat sheets, whenever I want to build something with grid. But it's super cool to say, but actually, yeah, we could do something like that, and we can kind of change the habits, because we've been kind of constrained all of those years by those super like strict layouts, 12 grid, and building those with floats, that we are kind of afraid to become creative again. But I really like those people who are currently taking examples of Bauhaus posters, and they're finding inspiration into the 60s or 70s, completely this structured art, and trying to rebuild this kind of layout with grid layout, because it's kind of really interesting examples, because then you have this kind of completely construct that is destructed on desktop, and it's still able to kind of look nicely on mobile. So yeah, I hope subgrid will become something fun in the near future. Yay!
Yes. So I think it was one of the most long Q&A session.
Sorry. I hope I replied to them. Anyway, there's my
so
website,
thank you again.
there's my Twitter. So if you have other questions, or if you need me to send one of those links I was talking about, I'm super bad at remembering names, but I'm quite good with faces. So shoot me an email or send me something on Twitter or on LinkedIn and ask for for links, and I will send them to you. Just put some context. Don't start with hello and nothing, because it's creepy.
So if you was too shy to ask question to Stephanie now, I will just cut the presentation, and we will go again to 5 minutes approximately in a network session. So thank you again, Stephanie.
Yeah, that was fun.
And so see you in the floor.
Okay.